All right, team, we are moving on. We finished up the bacteria and the viruses, and now we're moving into the kingdom Protista. And this is a kind of a big jump because now we're moving into eukaryotic organisms. So just keep that in mind. Now we have a nucleus, we have multicellularity. Okay. The module on Protista is module 5. And there's PowerPoint here called Kingdom Protista. So here's the thing right away, we have some interesting taxonomy because we're using subkingdoms, and we haven't really talked or heard much about the idea of putting the word sub in between a level of taxonomy in the hierarchy, but you can do that anywhere. You can have a subclass or a subfamily. Here we have a subkingdom. And so we often think of Kingdom Protista, and it's often referred to as kind of being a garbage kingdom. And the reason is because for a long time, it seemed like if something didn't fit anywhere else, then we dumped it into the Protista. And so the way that we're going to sort of try to understand the kingdom is by looking at the two subkingdoms. We have the subkingdom Protozoa and the subkingdom Algae. And the primary difference between these two subkingdoms is that the protozoans are heterotrophic and the algae are autotrophic, specifically photosynthetic. And so, you know, there are other differences as well, but I just go ahead and throw that in there right now, just so you have a sense of it. Okay. And what we're going to do is now taxonomy becomes more relevant because we have subkingdoms, and we're going to, in each subkingdom, we're going to look at the next level, which would be either a phylum or a division, depending upon what kingdom you're in. And that's a little bit annoying, but that's kind of the system that we're that we're left with. Okay, we'll talk about that in the next slide. So subkingdom Protozoa we're going to start with, and like we said in the last on the last slide, they're heterotrophic. They're also exclusively unicellular, and so for lack of a better way to describe them, we say they're unicellular and animal-like in the sense that they're heterotrophic. They can't photosynthesize, you know, they can't make their own sugar. So what do? Well, they're predatory or parasitic upon other organisms. And it turns out that the way that we divide these up, and it's important to understand what these words are, and I should have probably included that in the PowerPoint, but it's not, so I'm going to write it out here. These are phyla, this word phylum. And I don't know if you recall, but when we talked about taxonomy before, so this level here, these are all phylum names. Turns out, just quickly to understand, phylum and division are the same level. And what happened was, and I think we talked about this before, but at one of those meetings that they have where they discuss taxonomy, it was always phylum, this level right under kingdom, or so in this case subkingdom. And at one of these meetings, someone brought up the fact that the word phylum was inappropriate for whatever reason, for what it meant in Latin, or I don't know why. But they voted and they decided to change the name phylum, that level, to the name division. And everyone agreed to do it except for the zoologists. So the botanists and the mycologists that study the fungi, and you know, the folks that study bacteria, they all said, okay, yeah, we'll do that. But the zoologists were like, no way, we're not changing. So now we're stuck. If it's an animal or animal-like thing, at this level, we typically use the word phylum. If it's a plant or plant-like thing, we use the word division. And ironically, in the kingdom Protista, there's both. And so for the subkingdom Protozoa, we use phylum, and you'll see in a second for the subkingdom Algae, we use division. Okay, so these are phyla names. The basis of this taxonomy at the phylum level is means of motility. Okay, what is motility? Well, motility literally means you can move around. It's a little different from mobility. If you're mobile, you get into your car and drive to McDonald's, right? You're mobile. Motility just literally means you can move. It may not mean you're moving in any particular direction, okay? And so what we're going to see is that, the Mastigophora include the organisms that are called the flagellates, and the Ciliophora are the ciliates. We'll talk about how these organisms move, okay? As you could imagine, the flagellates have flagella, and the ciliates have cilia. And it's important to understand flagella and cilia are no different from one another in terms of their microscopic structure. They're both pretty much the same. We just choose if there are a few of them and they're long, we call them flagella. If there are many, many of them and they're short, we call them cilia, but structurally a flagellum and a cilium are pretty much made of the same things, right? And so you could imagine that these mastigophorans and ciliophorans can move around pretty fast. I mean, they swim, they live typically in water, or they could potentially be parasites inside of a larger organism, and they can move, okay? The Sarcodyna are the amoebas, and they make these things, and I'll just go ahead and give you the name. They move by these little structures called pseudopodia. Pseudo means false, podia, podium, podiatrist means what? A podiatrist is what kind of a doctor? Foot doctor. So this means false feet, okay? And we'll see what that looks like. And then the apicomplexa, this last group, is composed of non-motile parasites. These are obligate parasites. These organisms are only parasitic. They're not predatory in any other way. And they're non-motile, meaning they can't move. At the very best, a apicomplexan can kind of wiggle back and forth like this, and that's about it. Okay. So there's some preliminary info for this subkingdom. Now, one of the things that we really always want to do when we're talking about the taxonomy and these different groups is to understand, something about the human relevance and why are these organisms important, okay? Well, here we start with the Mastigophora. And what we know about the Mastigophora is that many of them are parasites, okay? So how are they, one of the first things we want to think about, what's the human relevance of this group? Well, human relevance is they can make us sick, they can be pathogenic. And if we use the term pathogen, that's fine. That can apply to these as well as smaller things like bacteria. And so right away we have this little booger here. This is Giardia lamblia. That's its species name. Now I'm going to tell you, we're studying this stuff really more on the kingdom, subkingdom, and phylum level. So I wouldn't hold you to the species name, but I give it to you just because there's a picture of it here. And let's just see what we're looking at. Remember, these organisms are exclusively unicellular. So here's its little unicellular body, kind of teardrop shaped, like this. This is a nucleus, and it looks like it has two of these. The nucleus is actually connected, and so the nucleus is really just bilobed, and that's what you're looking at here. This would be the dorsal surface, and then look, you can see these flagella. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that we can see, maybe 7, 8 right there, okay? If you flip to this little guy over on its ventral side, you would see that it has this sucking mouth part like this that allows it to attach and literally suck on its host cells. This particular organism causes a disease in mammals called giardiasis. And I don't know if anyone's ever had giardia or giardiasis, but it can be a serious illness. You would get this from drinking contaminated water, typically surface water, from streams, or you could also get it from eating food that's been washed in contaminated water. Now, you could imagine if you ingested the adult of this organism, your stomach acid is going to do this little guy in, and it's never going to be able to survive passing through your stomach and getting into your intestines. It's going to die pretty quickly. But these things shed eggs. That's an egg right there in the water. And they're actually called cysts. But they're the equivalent of a fertilized egg. And then what can happen is these things are resistant to stomach acid. They pass through the stomach. And then when they get into your duodenum, the upper part of your small intestines, they come out of their little cysts and they attach to the lining of your intestines, and they start to suck. They use their sucking mouth part to suck fluid and food right out of your cells. Now you could imagine this is quite an insult to your small intestines. And so what are the symptoms of giardia infection, giardiasis? Chronic diarrhea, cyclical chronic diarrhea. And so you might wake up in the morning and feel better, and you're like, oh, thank the Lord, it's gone. And then by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, boom, it's back. Okay. So we would see that. Because you're having the runs and you can't control your bowels, then you end up getting dehydrated and you lose electrolytes. So this can be very serious. Losing electrolytes and getting dehydrated can kill you, right? And so if you had a severe case of giardia, it could potentially kill you. Now here's a crazy thing. If you look worldwide, about 80% of humans either have giardia or have been exposed to it at some point in their life. Most of them are carriers of it. How could this be? I'm telling you, this thing makes you really sick. And then I'm telling you, well, 80% of humans have had it or do have it. Well, it's possible because most humans don't have access to clean water, right? We grow up in a chlorinated world here, and our water is safe to drink out of the tap. But if you go to the third world, you find out very quickly that that's not the case. So in some countries, babies, the first sips of water they take, they're inoculated with this organism. And your body adapts to it very, very well when you're little. You might have the runs for a few days and then you get used to it, but then you would be a carrier, right? So it is possible to adapt to. As an adult, it's much more difficult to adapt to. And so usually people take anti-flagellate drug like Flagyl. This is a trade name. The drug itself is called metronidazole. And metronidazole is a very toxic drug. And this brings up a good point. Just because you're taking a pharmaceutical drug doesn't necessarily mean it's not toxic, right? And metronidazole is a good example of that. It's a known liver carcinogen and tetragen, meaning it mutates liver cells and can cause cancer. But, you're weighing the cost of being chronically ill versus the thought that you could potentially increase your cancer risk. So most people opt to take the Flagyl and get rid of the parasite. Now, if that one sounds bad, it's not nearly as bad as this next one. And now what are we looking at? Well, if you've ever taken a histology class or a microbiology class even maybe, you might recognize all these little round circles as red blood cells, right? So just for perspective, here's one red blood cell right here, okay? All these little squiggly things that you see right here, here's an outline of one, and then you can see the flagella there. There's actually a couple of flagella. This little booger is called trypanosoma. And trypanosoma is the flagellate the mastigophorine, which causes in Africa a disease called African sleeping sickness. And then in South America, a disease called Chagas disease. And so the symptoms are very similar. They would present much like malaria with very high fevers. You could imagine your immune system going crazy with, this is someone's blood, and look at the density of this organism in their blood. This flagellate is literally swimming around in this person's blood, okay? So intense fever and malaise. They used to, in Africa, people that were infected with trypanosoma, they used to think they were really lazy. They're like, God, he's so lazy. Get out of bed, dude, But the person is debilitated. They're so sick, okay? So, we know that now it's not that they're lazy, it's that they're sick. We see this disease in Africa as well as South America. And in South America, the disease is called Chagas disease. And let me just say, in Africa, the vector, the thing that moves this parasite around is the mosquito. In South America, it's the dung beetle. And here's a picture of a dung beetle. You don't want to get bitten by a dung beetle. And they tell you, if you're traveling to a third world country, particularly in Argentina, parts of Argentina and Bolivia have trypanosoma endemic. And they tell you don't sleep in a daub and wattle structure, which is a structure basically made out of cow poop and clay, kind of like adobe, because it's a great home for these dung beetles. And if you're bitten by the dung beetle that has the trypanosoma parasite, you're likely to contract it. So this is a very serious illness that causes death if it's not treated. Here's a Coleophoran, and you know this little booger. You know what this booger is. Some of you do. You've probably looked at this little guy under the microscope in the 8th grade. This is called paramecium. And paramecium is not a parasite. It's predatory. It has a mouth, and it eats stuff. It eats bacteria and smaller protistans. So, but you can see all these cilia. See all the little cilia? That makes it a Coleophoran. And you could also imagine this thing's pretty agile. It can rhythmically flap its cilia and propel itself very coordinated manner through the water. And so where are you going to find this? This one is actually Blepharisma. It is not stained, by the way. It is actually really pink in color. It has some pink pigment in it. Problem with staining it is the stain would kill it, and then you wouldn't probably be able to see the cilia. So that's one of the reasons why we wouldn't stain it. These organisms are harmless. They're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. That means they're everywhere. They're found in water. And the water has to be, it can't be toxically polluted, but they can live in relatively stagnant water as well. Okay? Coleophora, moving by cilia. Next, we have the sarcodines, the sarcodina, and that's what you're looking at here. And these organisms are referred to as amoebas, right? And what is a pseudopod or pseudopodia? This is a pseudopod. It's an extension, as you can see here, of the cytoplasm of this organism. So how does an amoeba move? It moves by amoeboid motion, which is really slow. So what it does is it sends out this extension. Let's say it wants to move in this direction. It sends out this little false foot, right? And then the rest of the organism, including the nucleus, streams into the foot like this. It moves, it streams itself into this spot, and so it effectively moves from here to here. It's not real fast. Ironically, they're predatory. But what they do is they sneak up on bacteria. Right here is a bacteria. And look what this organism is doing. It's so clever. It's going to surround it. See, it's going to do endocytosis. Eventually, this foot's going to come around like this. And then the little bacteria is trapped inside a vesicle inside of the amoeba, and it can then engulf it. So most amoebas are found in water. They're harmless. There are some that are parasites, particularly one called entamoeba. Histolytica. And again, these species names you're not responsible for, but I give them to you just for your own knowledge. This is the organism which causes amoebic dysentery. Which can be a very serious disease if untreated. Unlike the Giardia, which lives in the small intestines, the entamoeba prefers the large intestines. And once it gets in your large intestines, it causes a lot of distress, just really serious bouts of diarrhea that you cannot control. And it turns out that it's the large intestines where the bulk of the water is reabsorbed from your feces. And so if you have an irritation of the large intestines, it's very serious because you just cannot maintain water balance. You're losing water at a rate that's virtually impossible to put back in. You're also losing electrolytes. We know that you cannot live without electrolytes. You'll die very quickly. So left untreated, entamoeba histolytica can be a very serious illness. There was about 10 years ago, I was working for the Forest Service in Tennessee, and there was a rainbow gathering. I don't know if you're familiar with the rainbow people, but they are a large tribe of free living folks that just kind of travel around and do their own thing. And they decided to have a national gathering in Joyce-Kilmer National Forest, which is not too far from here. And there were a lot of people, and it rained and rained and rained, and it was becoming a mess apparently. And so some of the my boss really in Tennessee in the Forest Service was like, get in this truck and drive over there and see what those hippies are doing. So that's what I did. I went and checked it out. The first thing I see is a bunch of naked people bathing and frolicking in the creek, or the river. And then I keep driving up the road, and then I see people pooping right beside the river. And I'm like, oh, this is not going to be good. Well, it wasn't good. They ended up with a massive epidemic outbreak of amoebic dysentery. And there was a line of hippies out the door of the local hospital. It overwhelmed the hospital. So, what's the take-home message? Don't poop and drink the water in the same place. And, surface water in general is not safe to drink. That's just the reality. You have to treat the water if you're drinking it. If it's surface water, what we mean by surface water is streams, creeks, lakes, anything where the water's not coming directly out of the ground is not safe to drink. Okay. So those are the sarcodines. Now the last group is called the apicomplexa. And the apicomplexa is non-motile. They don't have a way of moving, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. And they're also obligate parasites. So now, oops, shoot. I went all kind of haywire there, sorry. Don't know why that happened. Okay. So, try that again. So what we're dealing with then is a non-motile parasite, and by obligate, I mean they can't live without their host. Not only are they parasites, but they have to pretty much be in or on a host at all time. What are you looking at here? Here again are red blood cells. There's a red blood cell. this little sickle-shaped organism right here, and then there's another one right here. This little guy is called Plasmodium. That's the genus. And now let's think about this. If you're an obligate parasite, but you can't move, all you can really do is wiggle. How do you get from one host to the next? That would be the question. And the answer to that question is you use a vector, right? And a vector just means you use some other organism to move you around. Now, if you live in blood, what's the perfect vector for moving you around? It would have to be the mosquito, right? Because the mosquito drinks your blood. And so, you know, what literally happens is the mosquito sucks some red blood cells out of your body along with some of these plasmodium organisms and then transfers them to the next guy. And that's just a horrible thing, but that's the reality of it. What is plasmodium? Well, it's the organism that causes malaria. Let's break this down. What does this mean in Spanish? Mal aire, bad air, right? So malaria got its name from Spaniards. And so you're wondering what in the world does it have to do with the air? Well, nothing. But what they believed was that people got malaria from the swamp vapors, you know, the way a swamp smells, it has that sort of sulfury smell. They thought that breathing in the vapors from the swamp was what caused this disease. This is prior to the, you know, advent of the microscope. What is the connection with the swamp and malaria? Well, the mosquito, right? It's a breeding ground for the mosquito. And so that's just kind of a coincidence, okay? So, you know, here's the thing about malaria. We don't ever hardly think about it unless we're traveling abroad. There are people in third world tropical areas that think about it all the time because guess what? Malaria kills millions of people still every year. And it's killed, here's a crazy statistic, malaria, this one parasite, has killed more humans than all the other parasites in the group of the protozoans combined, right? So malaria is a horrible killer of humans throughout its history. Malaria is not a New World disease. It was actually brought to the New World from Europe. It is endemic to the Middle East and Africa and was brought to South America by the conquistadors, right? When they came, they brought malaria with them. Well, unfortunately for the indigenas, the people that were already living here, they had never been exposed to this disease. And because they'd never been exposed, they had no species resistance. So species resistance develops when an individual or when a species evolves with a particular parasite, in this case, malaria. It just means that the fitter people, the people that are more resistant to it, are going to survive and breed and pass that resistance gene on. Since South Americans had never been exposed, they had zero species resistance, we would think. And because of that, the disease took its toll, a much heavier toll on them than it did on the Europeans. Many more indigenos died from disease than died from, you know, direct attacks by Europeans or anything else. Okay. So cholera, yellow fever, malaria, these were all old world diseases brought to the new world by the Europeans. Okay. Ironically, the cure for malaria was also discovered in South America in the tropics. And there are lots of different stories about how the cure for malaria was discovered. Some say it was a shaman, some say it was a soldier, but the idea is that this, we'll say he was a shaman, he was a medicine man, he had contracted malaria in Colombia, which is a country in South America, and he was very ill, and he knew he was going to die, and so he he began just walking into the woods. He was basically just looking for a place to die. And he came to this spot where a large tree had fallen, a big tropical hardwood tree had fallen over, and there was a big puddle where the roots had been. It was full of water, and he began drinking the water because he had a fever and he was thirsty, and he just kept drinking the water and drinking the water, and he started to feel a little bit better, and he kept drinking the water, and eventually his malaria was resolved. It went away, and he then looked and saw what kind of tree it was and recognized it, because he was a medicine man, as a tree called cinchona. Cinchona is a genus of tropical tree. And it turns out that in the cinchona, there is a substance called quinine. And quinine is an interesting substance. It's a very bitter alkaloid. You've tasted it before if you've ever drinking tonic water. It's what makes tonic water a little bitter and dry. Or gin. Gin is actually flavored with quinine. There's a medical reason why those Europeans drank their gin and tonics all day. And the medical reason is to keep the quinine levels just high enough in the blood to prevent malaria. So the thing about quinine is it's both a prophylactic, meaning it can keep you from getting the disease, and also a curative, meaning it can cure the disease once you get it, or at least treat it. Okay. So this was a game changer for malaria. Now, what then happened was the Colombians who made this discovery guarded the cinchona and would not allow any seeds to be exported, and they began harvesting it. And pretty soon they were the cinchona kingpins. They were providing the entire world, including Europe, with this drug called quinine in the bark of the cinchona, and they were making a killing. There's one documented case where the Dutch were very keen to try to start a cinchona plantation on the island of Java, which they controlled in the South Pacific, and they bribed a Colombian soldier with some money to get them some seeds of the cinchona, and he did get them 15 seeds of cinchona. They made the transaction, and then the Colombian government found out, and they publicly hanged this soldier, and they said, this is what happens if you sell our very valuable crop to Europe. So, but the Dutch had the seeds, and they planted the seeds, and they grew these 15 trees up, and then it turned out to be the wrong species of cinchona. So it was unfortunate. Eventually, the Dutch did obtain the right species of cinchona, and they did develop a plantation on Java, and they became the kingpins of Europe for cinchona and quinine up until World War II. And what happened in World War II was that the Japanese captured the island of Java. And when this happened, all of a sudden, the Allies had no more cinchona. They were completely cut off from their supply of cinchona. And we began to lose the war, literally, because our troops were contracting malaria. You can't fight with malaria. You're very sick. You have fever. You're incredibly ill. And so the President of the United States made a call to the Smithsonian Institute, where a gentleman named Fosberg worked. Alan Fosberg was a civilian, but he was an expert in tropical botany. And the president was like, look, we need you to go to South America and find us some cinchona, because otherwise we're going to lose the war, quite literally. So Fosberg is like, well, okay. So he gets on a plane and he flies to Bogota in Colombia, South America. He checks into a hotel, and he's unpacking his things, and there's a knock on the door, and he's like, oh my goodness, I wonder who this is. And he opens the door, and standing at the door are two German soldiers in German soldier uniforms with machine guns and swastikas and the whole 9 yards. And Alan Fosberg looks at them and he's like, I guess this is it for me. And he was assuming they knew why he was there. And they said, you know, we know why you're here. And for $40,000, we can get you what you're looking for. These two German soldiers were traitors, and they must have intercepted some kind of a correspondence, and they provided the US government with the contact for the cinchona in exchange for $40,000, after which they just kind of disappeared into the South American sunset as very wealthy men. Okay, so this was a turning point in the war, if you can believe that, because all of a sudden now we have the cinchona again, we can treat the troops, and we eventually, of course, won. Were victorious in World War II. So what we've been talking about is a really good example of ethnobotany, right? Man's relationship with plants. And if you think about it, ethnobotany, plants are the basis of human material culture, not animals, but plants. And you can go all the way back into prehistoric times and start thinking about this. What do plants provide us with? Food, medicine, shelter, and transportation, right? How did the Vikings get around? In wooden boats with canvas sails, right? So, you know, I like to pull ethnobotany into the subject anytime we can, because it's fascinating when we start thinking about man's relationship to plants, okay? As far as the rest of it goes with Apicomplexa, with malaria and Plasmodium, the life cycle of this organism is incredibly complicated, as is true of many parasites, right? It has, and you are not, I'm just going to tell you, you are not responsible for this life cycle, okay? But you know, let's just look at it and we can talk briefly about it. There are human blood stages which are very infectious, and these are very tiny little infectious parts of the life cycle that can be sucked up by the mosquito. And so then you see what happens. Mosquito takes a blood meal, and then here's the mosquito stages, and then mosquito takes another blood meal. Of course, it wouldn't be on the same person, but you get the idea. And then this organism also, it survives and lives in the liver. And one of the things about malaria is it's a lot easier to prevent someone from getting it than it is to cure someone completely once they have it. Modern science, even to this day, can't 100% guarantee that they can get rid of the malaria from your liver. And so you may become reinfected at any time. And we don't know exactly what causes, you know, these dormant parasites to become active again. But, you know, just be aware, if you are traveling to a third world country and there is malaria, then you need to take a drug prophylactically, because you don't want to get malaria. Some of the drugs have side effects. Some of the side effects can be pretty severe. One of the side effects is they can make you sensitive to light, to sunlight, and UV light, which isn't great because usually you're going to be in a tropical climate when you're dealing with malaria. Another very strange side effect is dreams, and particularly violent dreams. And so for whatever reason, people that take some of these anti-malarial drugs have very vivid and disturbingly violent dreams. And this has been documented over and over. They can, of course, cause physical symptoms like gastrointestinal distress. They can cause nausea and this type of thing. But again, if you're traveling to a truly malarial area, you would want to take the anti-malarial drugs, because it's still not going to be as bad as contracting malaria. I would also caution you, though, to do some research. If you go down, for example, to the health department and you say, I'm going to Argentina. Well, parts of Argentina have malaria and they're going to prescribe you the drug, but it may very well be that the part of malaria or the part of Argentina that you're going to does not have malaria. And so it would be silly to take the drug. And so, you know, just be aware that it's done kind of country by country. And, do a little research to make sure that you definitely need to. But if there is malaria in the place you're going, you would definitely want to take the drug. Okay. So that, I believe, is the last slide, and that will bring us into our introduction into the next unit. But we're going to stop the video here. We'll do a separate video for the subkingdom algae. Now we're using the word division, and I'm sorry I didn't put the word phylum in on the other one, but you can see now it's the same level, but we're using the word division. And we're going to look at the following 6 divisions. I will tell you that taxonomy is a mess in this group of organisms, and if you look it up online, you'll see that the splitters have gotten together and split these things up into many, many different groups. So this is definitely going to be an older version of the taxonomy, but honestly, it's just a way to organize the names, and taxonomy is kind of a made-up thing, as we've said before. So this is the, sort of the version that I'm choosing to use for this class. If you want to see the most current version, which this is certainly not the most current version, if you're interested in seeing the most current version, by all means, you can look that up. And I certainly wouldn't, count it wrong on a test if you use different names, as long as they're appropriate. Okay. So I hope you've enjoyed that little talk on the protozoans, and think about the take-home message. What's the most important thing about them is that there are many that can be parasites of humans and other animals. Okay. All right, team. Good to see you. Good to see ya. And I'll see you later. Bye-bye.